1944. The world is on fire. Deep in the heart of Europe, the largest, bloodiest war in history grinds men into machines and turns green fields into graveyards of steel. In the midst of millions of deaths, of cold orders and the sheer chaos of battle, the life of a single man or a single animal was worth absolutely nothing. It was just another statistic. But what if, in that hell on earth, one soldier decided that one life, the life of a dog, was worth more than his own? This isn't just another war story. It's the story of a loyalty forged in fire, an act of disobedience that could have led to a firing squad and a suicidal rescue mission straight into enemy territory. Get ready for the story of Sergeant Frank Miller and the dog he refused to leave behind, even if it meant facing the German army all by himself. Sergeant Frank Miller was no hero, and he'd be the first to tell you that. He was just a guy from Ohio who'd been dealt a bad hand. Now he was wading through the mud and gore of the Hurtgen Forest, a place the GIs had grimly nicknamed the Death Factory. It was late 1944, and the relentless German resistance had turned this dense, dark woodland into a meat grinder. Every tree seemed to hide a sniper, every patch of ground a mine. The constant rain mixed with the blood of friends and foes alike, creating a foul-smelling soup that clung to their boots and their souls. Miller, like every other man in his company, was exhausted down to his very bones. The fear was a constant companion, a cold knot in his stomach that never went away. It wasn't the glorious combat of the newsreels. It was a miserable, grinding existence where survival was measured not in days, but in hours. The trees were so thick that artillery shells would detonate in the canopy, raining down a lethal storm of wood and steel shrapnel they called tree bursters. This wasn't a battlefield. It was a living nightmare designed by the devil himself. Miller had seen things that would haunt him forever. He'd seen boys who had been laughing and joking one minute become unrecognizable messes of flesh the next. He had long since stopped trying to make close friends. It just hurt too much when they were gone. He was a cog in a massive, uncaring war machine, and he knew it all too well. His job was simple, brutal, and repetitive. Take the next ridge, the next pillbox, the next ruined village. The cost was never mentioned in the briefings, but it was paid in full every single time. He moved, he fired, he dug, and he tried not to think. Thinking was dangerous. Thinking led to remembering the warmth of home, a place that now felt like another planet. In the Death Factory, humanity was a liability. Compassion was a weakness that could get you killed. The only things that mattered were following orders, keeping your head down, and making sure your rifle was clean. The man Frank Miller had been before the war was buried deep, hidden away beneath layers of mud, fatigue, and the cold necessity of survival. The men around him were the same, hollowed-out shells of their former selves. They shared rations, ammunition, and a profound, unspoken understanding of the hell they were in. They were a brotherhood forged in the worst possible circumstances, but even that bond was frayed by the constant grinding pressure of the front lines. The forest was winning, slowly but surely, by draining them of everything that made them human. This was the world Sergeant Frank Miller inhabited when his unit was ordered to advance on the outskirts of a small, bombed-out German village. It was just another objective on a map, another piece of worthless land to be bought with blood. He had no idea that this particular pile of rubble held something that would change everything, forcing him to make a choice no sane soldier would ever consider. He was about to come face to face with an enemy he never expected, one that would test his loyalty not to his country, but to his own soul. It was a confrontation that would set him on a path of unbelievable risk and rebellion. But before we continue with this incredible story, please, if you appreciate these tales of unsung heroism from the forgotten corners of history, take a moment to subscribe to our channel. It helps us keep these stories alive. And don't forget to hit the like button and drop a comment below, letting us know what city and country you're watching from. The advance on the village was a tense, nerve-wracking affair. Every shattered window and collapsed wall could be hiding a machine gun nest or a sniper. The air was thick with the smell of damp concrete and death. Miller's unit moved cautiously, clearing houses one by one in a grim, practiced rhythm. It was during this sweep that they saw him, a flicker of movement by a demolished farmhouse. Chained to a splintered post was a German shepherd. He was painfully thin, his ribs showing clearly beneath a coat of matted fur. He wasn't barking or growling, just trembling, his eyes wide with a terror that Miller knew all too well. The dog was a casualty of war, just like the humans who had once lived in this now ruined home, left behind in the chaos. But this wasn't just any stray. Around the dog's neck was a thick leather collar, and on it were clear insignias of the Wehrmacht. This was a trained German military dog. To the soldiers of Miller's unit, the animal was no different from a discarded rifle or a helmet. It was enemy equipment, a potential threat that couldn't be trusted under any circumstances. The lieutenant, a battle-hardened man named Davies, didn't hesitate. His voice was cold, pragmatic, and final. "It's a Kraut dog," he stated, spitting on the ground. "It could be trained to attack or give away our position. We can't leave it. Miller, take care of it." The order was unspoken but crystal clear. The dog had to be eliminated. A few of the men nodded in agreement. In this war, you didn't take chances. A barking dog at the wrong moment could bring an artillery strike down on their heads. They had seen booby traps on the bodies of their own comrades. A trained enemy dog was an unacceptable risk. It was a simple, logical calculation of war that left no room for sentiment. Miller looked at his rifle, then back at the dog. The animal flinched as he took a step forward, pulling at its chain with a pathetic whimper. It wasn't an enemy soldier. It wasn't a weapon. It was a terrified, starving creature trapped in a nightmare it couldn't possibly understand. Its crime was simply being born on the wrong side of the border. The other soldiers saw a Nazi dog, a symbol of the very enemy they were fighting and dying to defeat. They saw a tool of the German war machine, something to be neutralized without a second thought. It was a reflection of the dehumanization that war forces upon everyone, extending even to the animals caught in the crossfire. They were ready to move on. But when Sergeant Frank Miller looked into the dog's amber eyes, he didn't see an enemy. He saw the same raw, primal fear that he felt every single day in this godforsaken forest. He saw a living being that was just as much a victim of this madness as he was. And in that moment, something inside him snapped. The cold logic of war suddenly seemed like the most profound kind of insanity. He was standing in the ruins of a world gone mad, being ordered to kill a helpless animal. For the first time in a long time, the soldier took a back seat, and the man from Ohio stepped forward, ready to make a decision that went against everything he'd been trained to do. The fate of this enemy dog now rested entirely in his hands. Following orders meant pulling the trigger and walking away, another small death in a war filled with them. Disobeying meant inviting suspicion, anger, and a whole world of trouble he couldn't afford. The seconds ticked by, each one feeling like an eternity in the ruins of that German village. Miller gave Lieutenant Davies a curt nod. "I'll handle it, sir," he said, his voice betraying none of the turmoil raging inside him. The other men, satisfied that the problem would be dealt with, began to move on, securing the next set of buildings. They trusted Miller to do the dirty work, to follow the cold, hard calculus of the battlefield. But as soon as the squad was out of sight, Miller knelt down. He didn't raise his rifle. Instead, he slowly reached into his pack and pulled out a piece of his own dwindling sea rations, a dry, tasteless biscuit that was his only meal for the day. He held it out on his open palm, keeping his movements slow and non-threatening. The dog watched him, its body still trembling, but its ears twitched with interest. Hunger, it seemed, was a universal language. After a long, tense moment, the dog took a hesitant step forward and gently took the biscuit from Miller's hand, wolfing it down in seconds. It was a tiny gesture of trust in a world that had given it nothing but fear. In that instant, Miller's decision was solidified. He couldn't do it. He pulled out his combat knife, but instead of using it on the dog, he sawed through the thick leather leash that bound it to the post. The dog was free, but it didn't run. It stayed right there, looking up at the strange soldier who had shown it an unexpected kindness. Miller knew he was playing with fire. Harboring an enemy animal was a serious breach of protocol. He needed a name, a way to make it his own. With a grim sense of irony, he looked down at the German shepherd. "Well, I guess I'll call you Fritz," he whispered. It was a common, almost mocking nickname for a German, but for Miller it was an act of claiming him. He coaxed Fritz to follow him, keeping to the shadows and away from the main group. He would have to hide him, to somehow make this animal, a trained military dog of the enemy, invisible to his own comrades. It was a monumentally stupid and dangerous plan, born from a single, impulsive act of compassion that went against all his training and survival instincts. This wasn't a grand, heroic gesture. It was a quiet, personal rebellion. It was Frank Miller, the man, pushing back against Sergeant Miller, the soldier. He was drawing a line in the mud of Hürtgen Forest, declaring that there were some orders he just wouldn't follow, some acts he wouldn't commit, no matter the logic or the consequences. He was tired of the killing, tired of the destruction. Saving this one dog felt like saving a small piece of his own soul, a piece he thought the war had already destroyed. By secretly cutting that chain, he was also cutting himself loose from the cold, hard machine he was supposed to be, even if just for a moment. He quickly found a bombed-out cellar to hide Fritz in for the time being, giving him the last of his water. The dog, as if understanding the need for silence, curled up in a corner without a sound. Miller knew this was just the beginning. The hard part wasn't saving the dog. It was going to be keeping him alive and secret. As he rejoined his unit, no one said a word. They just assumed he had done what needed to be done. They didn't know that their sergeant had just committed a profound act of insubordination, one that would put not only his own life but all of theirs in a new and unpredictable kind of danger. The secret war for Fritz's life had begun. Keeping a German shepherd hidden in the middle of a war zone was, to put it mildly, a logistical nightmare. Fritz was not a small dog, and Miller was constantly on edge, terrified that a stray bark or a curious nose poking out from behind cover would expose his secret. He shared his rations, a sacrifice that didn't go unnoticed by the other hungry soldiers. It didn't take long for the truth to come out. A private named O'Malley stumbled upon Miller feeding the dog behind a ruined wall. The word spread through the unit like wildfire. The reaction was immediate and hostile. They weren't just surprised, they were furious. Miller had disobeyed a direct order and, in their eyes, endangered them all. "Are you out of your mind, Miller?" One of his own men, Corporal Jensen, hissed at him one evening. "It's a Kraut dog. It could start barking in the middle of the night and bring a whole damn German patrol down on us. You're going to get us all killed over some stupid animal." The sentiment was shared by almost everyone. Miller found himself completely isolated. At meals, men would sit away from him. On watch, his partners would keep a wide berth, their eyes filled with a mixture of anger and suspicion. They saw Fritz not as a rescued animal, but as a ticking time bomb, a traitor in their midst that could betray them at any moment with its instincts. The tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Every time a twig snapped nearby, the men would glare first at the dog, then at Miller. They blamed him for adding another layer of unpredictable danger to an already lethal environment. He was no longer just their sergeant. He was the fool who valued a Kraut mutt over their lives. Lieutenant Davies confronted him directly. "I gave you an order, Sergeant," he said, his voice dangerously low. "You told me you handled it. This is not handled. This is a liability. Get rid of that dog. That's a final order." But Miller, having already crossed the line, found he couldn't go back. He simply replied, "He's not a threat, sir." This open defiance was shocking. It bordered on insubordination worthy of a court-martial. Davies was livid, but with the unit constantly in combat, he couldn't afford to lose an experienced NCO. He let it slide for now, but with a stern warning. If that dog makes one wrong move, I'll shoot it myself, and you'll be right behind it, Miller." Miller was now an outcast, his authority undermined and his judgment questioned by the very men he was supposed to lead. His act of compassion had cost him the trust of his unit. He and Fritz were a lonely island in a sea of hostility. Miller had to constantly watch his back, not just for the Germans, but for his own men. He spent his nights with Fritz, sharing a foxhole, the dog's warm body a small comfort against the biting cold and the crushing loneliness. He would talk to the dog in low whispers, telling him about home, about a life without guns and death. In those moments, Fritz was his only friend, the only living being who didn't look at him with accusation. Miller had made his bed, and now he had to lie in it. He believed in his heart that he had done the right thing, but that belief was being tested every single minute. The pressure was immense. Sooner or later, something had to give. Fritz would have to prove his worth, or Miller's gamble would end in disaster for everyone. The opportunity for Fritz to prove himself came sooner than anyone expected. The platoon was on a silent night patrol, moving through a particularly dense section of the forest. The darkness was absolute, a suffocating blanket that played tricks on the eyes and ears. Every soldier was on high alert, their fingers hovering over the triggers of their rifles. The tension was palpable. Miller, as usual, had Fritz moving just ahead of him, not on a leash, but following closely. The dog moved with a natural stealth that no human could match, his paws making almost no sound on the damp earth. The other men still watched Fritz with suspicion, their distrust a tangible presence in the dark. They saw him as a liability, not an asset. They were moving towards a creek bed, a landmark on their map when it happened. Without any warning, Fritz stopped dead in his tracks. He didn't make a sound, but Miller could feel the tension in the animal's body. The hair on the back of Fritz's neck bristled, and a low, almost inaudible growl rumbled deep in his chest. Fritz planted his feet and refused to move forward. He looked back at Miller, his eyes glowing faintly in the dim light, and then stared intently into the blackness ahead. Miller knew instantly that something was wrong. This wasn't the behavior of a normal dog. This was the heightened sense of a trained animal detecting a threat his own human senses had missed entirely. "Hold up!" Miller whispered into his radio, his voice tight. He held up a hand, and the men behind him reluctantly froze in place, annoyed at the unscheduled stop. "What is it, Miller?" Jensen hissed from behind him. "Is your pet seeing ghosts?" The contempt in his voice was clear, but Miller ignored it, his focus entirely on the dog. Trusting the dog's instincts over his own orders, Miller signaled for his men to take cover. They grumbled, but they obeyed the silent command, melting into the shadows of the trees lining the path. They lay there in the cold mud, waiting, the silence of the forest pressing in on them. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then they heard it, the faint sound of boots squelching in the mud, followed by the low murmur of voices speaking German. From the darkness ahead, a heavily armed German patrol emerged, at least a dozen men, their machine guns held at the ready. They walked right through the spot where Miller's squad would have been if they hadn't stopped. They were on a collision course for a deadly ambush, and they would have walked straight into it. The German patrol was larger, better armed, and would have had the element of surprise. It would have been a slaughter. The American soldiers held their breath, not daring to move a muscle as the enemy patrol passed by, completely oblivious to their presence. Once the Germans were gone, a collective, silent sigh of relief went through the squad. They looked at each other, their faces pale in the darkness. Then they all looked at Fritz, who was now relaxed, the threat having passed. The Kraut dog hadn't betrayed them. He had just saved every single one of their lives. In the silence of the forest, the palpable hostility towards Fritz and Miller began to melt away, replaced by a grudging, undeniable respect. Corporal Jensen caught Miller's eye and gave a slow, deliberate nod. No words were needed. Fritz had just proven his loyalty in the most dramatic way possible, and things were never going to be the same again. After the incident on the night patrol, the atmosphere in the platoon changed dramatically. Fritz was no longer seen as Miller's mutt or the Kraut dog. He was now their unofficial mascot, a good luck charm with a nose for trouble. Soldiers who had once cursed him now saved scraps of their rations for him. He had earned his place in the squad. Fritz, for his part, seemed to thrive on the attention. He was a constant presence, offering a quiet companionship that was a welcome relief from the grim realities of war. He would nudge a soldier's hand during a moment of quiet dread, or simply lay his head on the lap of a man lost in thoughts of home. He became a piece of normalcy in a world of insanity. Miller felt a profound sense of vindication, but more than that, he felt a deepening bond with the dog. He had risked everything for Fritz, and Fritz had repaid him by saving not just him, but the entire unit. Their connection was no longer just about a man saving a dog, but about two survivors looking out for each other. This bond was about to be tested in the most violent way imaginable. A few days later, their position was targeted by a ferocious German artillery barrage. The world dissolved into a deafening chaos of screaming shells and earth-shattering explosions. Men scrambled for cover in their foxholes, praying that the next shell wouldn't have their name on it. Miller was caught in the open, trying to pull a wounded private to safety, when a shell landed terrifyingly close. The concussion threw him through the air like a rag doll. He landed hard, his helmet flying off, his ears ringing so loudly he couldn't hear his own thoughts. He was dazed, disoriented, and completely vulnerable. He struggled to get to his feet, his vision swimming. That's when he saw it. Another shell, a German 88, was screaming down from the sky, heading almost directly for his position. It was all happening in slow motion. He knew he wouldn't be able to get to cover in time. He was completely exposed. This was it. Before he could even process his own death, a brown and black blur shot towards him. It was Fritz. The dog, instead of cowering in fear like any sane creature would, launched himself at Miller with the full force of his body. He wasn't attacking, he was pushing, driving Miller backward with a desperate, powerful shove. The force of the dog's impact sent Miller tumbling backward into a shallow crater, just as the artillery shell hit the ground a few meters away. The world erupted in a cataclysm of fire, dirt, and shrapnel. The spot where Miller had been standing just a second before was obliterated, turned into a smoking hole of scorched earth. When the ringing in his ears subsided, Miller pushed himself up. He was covered in dirt and bleeding from a few minor cuts, but he was alive. Lying beside him, whimpering softly, was Fritz, his side peppered with small pieces of shrapnel. The dog had unhesitatingly thrown himself into the path of danger, shielding Miller with his own body. Miller stared at the dog, a wave of awe and gratitude washing over him. It was no longer a matter of respect or luck. This was a debt, a profound and undeniable blood debt. Fritz hadn't just saved his life from an ambush, he had directly and physically saved him from certain death. It was a moment that would forever seal their fates together. The artillery barrage was just the beginning. It was the prelude to a massive, coordinated German counterattack. Suddenly, the forest erupted with the terrifying clatter of panzer tanks and the relentless buzz of MG-42 machine guns. Shells rained down, and waves of German soldiers in grey uniforms emerged from the trees, screaming as they charged. Miller's unit was caught completely off guard and horrifically outgunned. They fought back bravely, but it was a losing battle. The line was collapsing all around them. The radio crackled with a single frantic order from Lieutenant Davies. Fall back now, it's a full retreat, every man for himself." Chaos ensued. It was no longer an orderly withdrawal, it was a desperate scramble for survival. Men abandoned their positions and ran, their training replaced by the primal instinct to live. The air was a maelstrom of noise, explosions, gunfire, shouting, and the screams of the wounded. It was the very definition of hell on earth. In the midst of the pandemonium, Miller was trying to keep his men together, but it was impossible. He had Fritz close by his side, the dog staying low to the ground, clearly terrified by the overwhelming noise, but sticking close to the man he trusted. Miller grabbed the dog's collar, trying to guide him through the mayhem. A nearby explosion from a tank shell sent a shower of dirt and debris over them. The sheer concussive force of it knocked Miller off his feet. In that split second of confusion, Fritz's collar was ripped from his grasp. The dog, now consumed by pure animal panic, bolted. But he didn't run towards the American lines. Disoriented and terrified, Fritz ran the wrong way. He sprinted back towards the chaos, back towards the bombed-out village they had just taken, the very same village that was now being overrun and reclaimed by the charging German forces. It was a fatal mistake, born of pure terror. "Fritz, no!" Miller screamed, his voice swallowed by the din of battle. He watched in horror as the dog, his only true friend in this hellhole, became a small, fleeting shape disappearing into the thick smoke and confusion of the front line. He saw Fritz for a single heartbreaking instant before he vanished completely behind the advancing enemy line. For a moment, Miller was frozen. Every instinct screamed at him to run after the dog, to follow him into the inferno. But Corporal Jensen grabbed his arm, pulling him back with all his strength. "Frank, leave it. We have to go now, or we're dead," he yelled, his face a mask of desperation. Torn between his duty to his men and his loyalty to the dog who had saved his life, Miller allowed himself to be dragged away. He took one last look back at the smoke-choked village where Fritz had disappeared. His heart felt like a lead weight in his chest. He was retreating, saving his own life, but he was leaving his savior behind. The retreat was a success, if you could call it that. They made it back to the fallback position, battered, bruised, and with their numbers severely depleted. They were alive, but as Frank Miller huddled in a new foxhole, listening to the distant sounds of the battle raging on, he felt nothing but a hollow, gut-wrenching despair. He had failed him. As the chaos of the retreat settled into the grim reality of a defeated position, Miller's mind was consumed by a single thought: Fritz. He couldn't eat, he couldn't rest. The image of the dog running back into the fire was burned into his memory. He felt a sense of guilt so profound it was physically painful. He owed that dog his life, and he had run away. He approached Lieutenant Davies, who was poring over a map with a grim expression, trying to make sense of their losses. "Sir," Miller began, his voice strained, "we have to go back for him. We can't just leave him there." Davies looked up, his eyes weary and bloodshot, not comprehending at first. "Go back for who? We lost 6 men, Miller." "Fritz, sir," Miller said, his desperation making him bold. "He ran back towards the village. We could take a small patrol, slip back in, find him." He trailed off as he saw the look on the lieutenant's face shift from confusion to sheer, unadulterated disbelief. Davies looked at Miller as if he had just sprouted a second head. "Are you out of your goddamn mind, Miller?" Davies finally exploded, his voice a harsh whisper that cut through the air. "I've got men dead and dying. We're barely holding this line. The Germans are everywhere. And you want me to authorize a mission to risk more men's lives for a dog?" The lieutenant stood up, his face inches from Miller's. "Listen to me, and listen good. Men are dying every single minute. I'm writing letters home to mothers and wives, telling them their sons and husbands aren't coming back, and you have the audacity to talk to me about a damn dog. What is wrong with you?" Miller tried to argue. "But he's not just a dog, sir. He saved my life. He saved all our lives." But Davies wasn't listening. He saw only the insane request of a soldier who had clearly lost his perspective, a man whose priorities had been warped by the horrors of the front line. It was a classic sign of combat fatigue. "It's just a dog, Sergeant," Davies finally roared, slamming his hand down on the crate he was using as a table. "That's an order. We are not risking one more human life for that animal. He's gone. You will forget about him. You will get your head back in this war and do your job. Am I making myself clear?" The words hit Miller like a physical blow. The cold, brutal logic of the military hierarchy was absolute. A dog, even a heroic one, was an expendable asset. Humans were not. The case was closed. There would be no rescue mission. The army had officially condemned Fritz to whatever fate awaited him behind enemy lines. Miller saluted numbly, his face a stony mask, and walked away. He felt utterly defeated. He looked out over the churned-up earth towards the German lines, where smoke still rose from the village. The system he served, the very army he fought for, had just told him that the life of his friend was worthless. He sat alone, cleaning his rifle with mechanical, unthinking movements. The lieutenant's words echoed in his head. "It's just a dog." But Miller knew better. Fritz was more than that. He was loyalty. He was a symbol of something good in this endless nightmare. And if the army wouldn't save him, then the army's rules no longer mattered. Night fell over the new front line, bringing with it a deceptive calm. The sounds of battle had faded to a distant rumble, but the tension remained. For Sergeant Frank Miller, however, there was no calm. His mind was a battlefield of its own, torn between the brutal pragmatism of his training and a loyalty that defied all logic. He couldn't shake the image of Fritz saving him from the artillery shell. It played over and over in his head, the selfless, instinctual act of a creature who had thrown itself in harm's way for him. How could he live with himself if he did any less? How could he sleep in a foxhole knowing Fritz was out there, hurt and alone? The lieutenant's words, "It's just a dog," had the opposite of their intended effect. Instead of forcing Miller to accept the loss, they solidified his resolve. It wasn't just about Fritz anymore. It was a stand against the callousness of the war, a refusal to let the machine grind up one more good thing without a fight. He looked across the dark, forbidding expanse of no man's land. It was a hellscape of craters, tangled barbed wire, and the unseen eyes of German snipers. It was a place where life was measured in seconds. To willingly go out there alone was not just a violation of orders. It was suicide. It was an act of pure madness. And yet the thought of doing nothing was even more unbearable. He felt a debt, a profound obligation that went deeper than any military code. In this war, he had seen men betray each other for a dry pair of socks. Fritz, an animal, had shown more loyalty and courage than many humans he knew. He couldn't betray that. He wouldn't. He made his decision. It wasn't a choice born of courage or heroism. It was a choice born of necessity, the desperate act of a man trying to hold on to a piece of his own humanity. If the United States Army would not sanction a mission to save his friend, then Sergeant Frank Miller would go AWOL to do it himself. This was a monumental betrayal of his duty. He would be branded a deserter. If he was caught by the Americans, he could face a firing squad. If he was caught by the Germans, his fate would be just as grim. He was about to willingly step into a limbo where both sides would see him as the enemy. He knew the risks. He weighed them in his mind, but they felt strangely insignificant compared to the weight of his guilt and the strength of his loyalty. This wasn't a rational decision. War had stripped away rationality long ago. This was something else, something more primal, a promise he had made to himself and to the dog. He began to make his quiet preparations, his movements slow and deliberate in the darkness. He wasn't thinking about the consequences or the astronomical odds against him. He was focused on the mission. A singular, insane purpose had taken hold of him. Cross the lines, find the dog and bring him back, or die trying. As he looked out at the darkness one last time before setting his plan in motion, he knew that what he was about to do was, by any military definition, an act of insanity and treason. But in the twisted, moral landscape of the war, it felt like the only sane and honorable thing left for him to do. Under the sliver of a moon, Miller moved like a phantom through the American trench. He waited until the watch changed, using the moment of distraction to slip into the supply dugout. His hands, steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him, worked quickly and silently. He wasn't stealing for personal gain. He was equipping himself for an impossible mission. He gathered 2 extra bandoliers of M1 Garand ammunition, a pair of fragmentation grenades, and a small medical kit filled with sulfur powder and bandages, more for the dog than for himself. He stuffed his pockets with a few extra ration bars. Every item was chosen with a specific purpose in mind. This was not a rash act. It was a calculated, albeit insane, operation. There was one man in the platoon he trusted, Corporal Jensen, the same soldier who had once distrusted Fritz but had come to respect him. Miller found a scrap of paper and, by the faint light of a shielded match, scribbled a short, simple note. "Jensen, I'm going to get him. It's a debt. Don't let them list me as a deserter. Miller." He folded the note and tucked it into Jensen's pack, where he would be sure to find it in the morning. It was a small act, but an important one. He didn't want to be remembered as a coward who ran from the fight. He wanted at least one person to know the truth. He was running towards a different kind of fight. With his preparations complete, he took a deep breath. This was the point of no return. He slung his rifle over his shoulder, crawled to the edge of the trench, and slid over the top. The mud was cold and wet, instantly soaking through his uniform. He was in no man's land now, a ghost in the night. He began to crawl on his belly, moving with a torturous slowness. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sounded like a gunshot in the deathly quiet. He used the craters and shattered tree stumps for cover, his senses screaming with hyper-awareness. He was alone, a solitary figure in a landscape designed for killing. The journey was agonizing. He had to navigate through tangled webs of barbed wire that tore at his clothes and skin. He had to feel his way through the dark, praying that his next handhold wasn't the trigger of a bouncing Betty mine. The fear was a living thing, a cold presence coiling in his gut, but his purpose drove him forward. He was no longer Sergeant Miller of the U.S. Army. He was a renegade, a man operating outside of any law but his own. He was a deserter on a righteous mission, a traitor pursuing a higher loyalty. He moved through the darkness, not as a soldier, but as a hunter, searching for a member of his pack. The faint skeletal outlines of the ruined village began to appear on the horizon, silhouetted against the night sky. He was getting closer. He was now deep inside territory that the Germans had reclaimed just hours before. He was an intruder, a whisper in the dark, heading straight into the heart of the enemy's lair. His solitary mission had truly begun. He was one man, armed with a rifle and an insane promise against an entire army. The odds were impossible, his chances of survival almost non-existent. But as he crawled through the mud and debris, he felt more purpose than he had in months. He was coming for his friend. The deeper Miller pushed into enemy-held territory, the more perilous his journey became. The world was a labyrinth of shadows and treacherous ruins. He wasn't just hiding from the Germans anymore. The terrifying whistle of American artillery shells passing overhead served as a stark reminder that he was now a target for everyone. A friendly shell would kill him just as dead as a German one. He moved with the patience of a predator, sometimes staying completely still for 20 minutes at a time, listening. He heard the murmur of a German patrol passing just a few yards from his hiding spot in a ditch. He could smell their cigarettes on the cold night air, and he held his breath until his lungs burned, praying he wouldn't be discovered. His progress was measured in feet, not miles. Every 50 yards felt like a monumental victory. He navigated by instinct and the faint glow of fires burning in the distance. The village he was heading for was not a single objective anymore. It was a series of deadly puzzles he had to solve one step at a time to stay alive. As dawn threatened to break, painting the eastern sky in shades of grey, he stumbled upon a grim scene. Propped against the wall of a collapsed barn was the body of a young German soldier, his eyes open and staring blankly at the sky. He couldn't have been more than 18. Miller felt a pang of something, not pity, not hatred, just a shared, weary humanity. This boy was just like him, another piece of cannon fodder caught in the gears of the war. But Miller's focus quickly shifted to survival. He noticed the soldier's haversack was still full. After a moment of hesitation, Miller knelt down. He said a silent, perfunctory prayer for the dead boy, and then opened the pack. Inside, he found a tin of meat and a piece of hard bread. It was German army rations, the food of his enemy. But in this moment, there were no enemies, only the living and the dead. Miller took the food without a second thought. It wasn't for him. He tucked it safely into his own pack, thinking only of Fritz. This dark, somber moment encapsulated the insanity of his mission. He was risking his life to save a German dog, and to do so, he was now carrying German food taken from a dead German soldier. The lines of allegiance and enmity had blurred into a meaningless grey smudge. All that mattered was the singular goal ahead. He found a hiding spot in a deep rubble-filled crater just as the sun came up, pulling a muddy tarp over himself. He would have to wait for darkness to fall again before he could move. The day was spent in a state of suspended animation, listening to the sounds of the German-occupied village, trying to pick out any sign of a dog. He was a ghost, trapped between two worlds, belonging to neither. He was hunted by the Germans as an enemy infiltrator and would be hunted by the Americans as a deserter. He was utterly and completely alone, a man who had abandoned his army and his country for a friend with four legs. As dusk began to settle again, Miller ate a small piece of his own ration bar, saving the German food for its intended recipient. The fatigue was immense, but his will was made of iron. He was close now. He could feel it. Tonight, he would enter the village itself. Tonight, he would find Fritz. Under the cover of a second night, Miller slipped into the skeletal remains of the village. It was even more devastated than he remembered, a ghost town of shattered buildings and silent streets. He moved from ruin to ruin, a whisper in the wind, calling Fritz's name in a low, desperate voice that was barely audible even to himself. He searched for hours, his hope beginning to fade with every empty cellar and collapsed house he checked. The dog could be anywhere. He could be dead, buried under rubble, or captured by the Germans. The thought was a cold spike of fear in his gut, but he pushed it down and kept searching, driven by his stubborn promise. He was drawn to the largest remaining structure in the village, a church whose steeple had been blown off, leaving a jagged stump pointing at the sky. It seemed like a logical place for a scared animal to seek shelter. He crept towards the gaping hole where the main doors used to be, his rifle at the ready. Inside, the moonlight streamed through holes in the roof, illuminating a scene of utter desecration. Pews were overturned and the floor was littered with debris. It was there, huddled in the shadows beneath the remains of the altar, that he saw him. A flicker of movement, a pair of familiar eyes reflecting the moonlight. It was Fritz. "Fritz!" Miller whispered, his voice thick with relief. The dog's ears perked up. He let out a soft whimper and limped out of the shadows. His leg was injured, a nasty gash from a piece of shrapnel, and he was clearly weak from hunger, but he was alive. The reunion was silent and tense, a quiet meeting of survivors in a ruined sanctuary. Miller immediately took out the medical kit and the German rations. As Fritz devoured the food, Miller cleaned and bandaged the dog's leg as best he could. The dog licked his hand, a simple gesture of gratitude that made the entire insane journey worthwhile. For a fleeting moment there was peace in their small corner of hell. But the moment was shattered in an instant. They both froze at the sound of crunching gravel outside, followed by the unmistakable sound of German voices. They were sharp, guttural, and getting closer. A beam of a flashlight cut through the darkness of the church entrance. A German patrol was coming inside to inspect the ruins. Miller's heart hammered against his ribs. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. He and Fritz flattened themselves behind the stone altar, the only piece of solid cover available. Miller quietly chambered around in his M1 Garand, his knuckles white. He was trapped, cornered like an animal. The German soldiers stepped inside, their boots echoing in the cavernous space. There were at least 3 of them. Miller could hear their casual conversation, see the beams of their flashlights dancing across the walls, getting closer and closer to their hiding spot. This was it, the end of the line, the end of the... He prepared himself to fight to the death. He would not be taken alive, and he would not let them take Fritz. He pressed himself against the cold stone, rifle aimed at the spot where the soldiers would appear, his mind racing. His suicide mission had led him to this final, desperate confrontation deep behind enemy lines. The footsteps grew louder. The beams of light swept across the floor, inching closer to the altar. Miller's finger tightened on the trigger. He was ready to unleash a final, desperate burst of violence. He knew he was outnumbered and outgunned, but he would take as many of them with him as he could. It was a grim, hopeless calculation. Suddenly, Fritz stirred beside him. Miller put a hand on him, expecting a growl that would give them away. But the dog did something completely unexpected. Instead of showing aggression, Fritz let out a low, inquisitive whimper. Then, before Miller could stop him, the dog limped out from behind the altar and into the open. Miller's blood ran cold. It was over. The dog had just signed their death warrants. He braced for the inevitable shout of alarm, the hail of gunfire, but it didn't come. Instead, the German voices stopped. One of the soldiers, a boy who looked no older than 17, lowered his rifle and shone his flashlight on the limping German shepherd. The young soldier's face was not filled with hate or aggression, but with a look of surprise and recognition. He knelt down slowly and spoke to Fritz in a soft, gentle German. Fritz, instead of attacking, limped forward and nudged the boy's outstretched hand, a clear sign of trust. It was a surreal, unbelievable moment. The young soldier looked at the dog's makeshift bandage, then his eyes lifted and met Miller's in the shadows behind the altar. For a long, silent moment, the two enemy soldiers just stared at each other. The American, a hardened sergeant hiding with a rifle. The German, a fresh-faced youth who was probably scared out of his mind. In that moment, they weren't enemies. The German boy saw not a GI to be killed, but a man who had clearly risked everything to come back for his injured dog. He saw the story written in their shared exhaustion and desperation. He saw the bond between a man and his animal, a bond that transcended uniforms and flags. The other German soldiers were looking at their young comrade, confused. The boy stood up, his face unreadable. He gave Fritz a final gentle pat on the head. Then he looked directly at Miller one last time. He gave a subtle, almost imperceptible shake of his head, then raised his hand and pointed silently towards a gaping hole in the back wall of the church. It was a route of escape, a safe way out. The young soldier then turned his back on the altar, deliberately shining his flashlight into a different, empty corner of the church. "Nichts here," he called out to his comrades. "Nothing here. Let's go." He led the patrol away, pretending he had seen nothing but shadows and debris. Miller was stunned into immobility. He couldn't believe what had just happened. An enemy soldier had just looked him in the eye, understood his mission, and deliberately chosen to save his life. It was a moment of shocking, profound humanity in the absolute heart of the war's inhumanity. He had been saved by the very enemy he was there to fight. Wasting no time, he grabbed Fritz and half-carried, half-guided him towards the escape route the German boy had pointed out. They slipped out the back of the church and disappeared into the darkness, leaving the patrol behind. Miller had found his dog, and in the process, he had found that even in the enemy there was a shared spark of compassion. The journey back was just as harrowing, but this time Miller wasn't alone. With Fritz by his side, he felt a renewed strength. They made it back to the American lines just before dawn, a filthy, exhausted and blood-soaked pair of survivors. Miller surrendered to the first sentry he saw, expecting the worst. He wasn't disappointed. He was immediately arrested and thrown into a makeshift brig. He was a deserter, caught returning from behind enemy lines. The charge was open and shut. He was facing a court-martial, and in the midst of a brutal campaign like Hurtgen, the punishment for desertion in the face of the enemy was often death by firing squad. But then, something unexpected happened. News of Miller's insane one-man rescue mission spread through his platoon. The story was first whispered, then told openly. Corporal Jensen presented the note Miller had left him, proving he hadn't run from a fight, but towards one. The men, who now saw Fritz as a hero in his own right, refused to stay silent. A delegation of soldiers, led by Jensen, went directly to Lieutenant Davies. They told him the whole story, how Fritz had saved them all from the ambush, how he had shielded Miller from the artillery shell, and how Miller had gone back for him because of that debt. They argued that Miller's actions, while against the rules, were born of the highest form of loyalty. Lieutenant Davies listened, his face grim. He was a man who followed the book, but he was also a man who understood the strange bonds forged in combat. He was moved, and perhaps a little ashamed of his own cold dismissal of Miller's plea. He went to see Miller in the brig, and for the first time he truly looked at the sergeant's exhausted but resolute face. In a shocking turn of events, the official reports of Miller's absence were lost. The charges of desertion vanished. Instead, a new report, quietly filed by Davies, stated that Sergeant Miller had undertaken a highly dangerous, unsanctioned, deep reconnaissance patrol, during which he had successfully recovered a valuable asset, referring to Fritz. The case was closed. The war in Europe eventually ended, but Miller's fight was not over. The military had a strict policy against transporting animals back to the United States on troop ships. Fritz, the war hero, was slated to be left behind in Europe. Miller, having faced the entire German army, was not about to be defeated by paperwork. He began his new campaign, this one fought with pen and paper instead of a rifle. He wrote letter after letter, pleading his case to anyone who would listen. He told the story of Fritz's loyalty and bravery, of the blood debt he owed the dog. His story, passed up the chain of command, eventually landed on the desk of a compassionate general. The general, a dog lover himself, was so moved by the tale of the sergeant and his German shepherd that he made a special exception. He personally signed the transport papers, granting Fritz passage to America. It was the final victory, a triumph of loyalty over the cold, impersonal machinery of bureaucracy. Frank Miller and the dog he had ironically named Fritz, now officially renamed Gunner in honor of the artillery he survived, finally boarded the ship home. They had survived the hell of the Hurtgen Forest, a suicide mission, and the labyrinth of military law. Against all odds, the two survivors, the man and his dog, were going home together. Frank Miller and Gunner returned not to a parade, but to the quiet life they had both earned. Far from the sounds of war, they spent years together in a small suburban house, their days filled with games of fetch and peaceful naps in the sun. The bond forged in the crucible of battle became a gentle, lifelong friendship. Their story is a powerful testament that even in the darkest abyss of human conflict, compassion and loyalty can bloom in the most unlikely of places. Sergeant Miller defied an army, not to take a life, but to save one. In doing so, he rescued more than just his dog. He rescued his own humanity from the wreckage of war. In the end, medals tarnish and the details of battles fade into history books. But the story of a friendship like this, of a loyalty that crossed enemy lines and defied all orders, is timeless. It reminds us that sometimes the most heroic acts are not about fighting, but about refusing to let go of what truly matters. Thank you so much for watching and for allowing us to share this incredible story with you. We have a question for you. What do you think was the most courageous moment in Sergeant Miller's journey? Defying his lieutenant, crossing into no man's land, or facing down the bureaucracy? Let us know in the comments below. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel and give this video a like to help us share more stories of unsung heroes. Until the next video, take care.